people into. But to those who are concerned that, for example, they're saying, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, I would agree with that. I don't think that Jesus is saying that you did something wrong, especially if you, I mean, in some cases, it's very obvious. Like you're very passive in the whole thing. It was something that was done to you. He's not saying that you're wrong. He's saying that you're involved in a situation that deviates from God's design. So I think that that's the thing. But I would say this. If you're so concerned about being called a sinner, understand in this passage, Jesus also called you a murderer, and he called you a liar, and he called you all kinds of things. Because the purpose of it is to say, you are far more sinful than you even realize, or than any of us would prefer to recognize.
Well, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. We're glad that you are with us. I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady, pastor of Whitefields Community Church in Longmont, Colorado, and we are glad that you're joining us here online for Sermon Extra. We are currently in our study of the Gospel of Matthew called Behold Your King. And so we just this Sunday went through a passage in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 through 48, a section where Jesus is talking about being perfect like your heavenly Father is perfect. In fact, the title of the message was How to Be Perfect. So we want to talk a little bit more about that today in the Sermon Extra. But if you missed the sermon, then we encourage you to go to whitefieldschurch.com. And you can download the sermon. You can watch it there. You can also get it on the app. We have an app, so you can download the app in the Google Play Store, in the App Store, and then you'll have not only all of the sermons, but you'll have all the information of what goes on here at Whitefields. And so we encourage you to do that. You can also find us on Facebook, on YouTube. You can find us on different podcast sources. So anytime that you're watching and streaming or on these platforms, we encourage you to like and to share and to interact with the content, leave a comment, ask a question, and it definitely helps and it boosts us in the search so that people, when they're looking for information on passages like Matthew chapter 5, they'll find Whitefields, they'll get good, solid biblical answers for their questions. And so today we want to talk about Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 through 48, but maybe more specifically, verse 32, which is where Jesus says here on the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery." And so a lot of questions have come up. A lot of questions have been asked throughout all time in history about this passage. And so we want to just talk a little bit more about that, let Nick share with us some more information, and even maybe connected to the original sin and culpability and how that all kind of is connected, especially in a situation where somebody maybe finds themselves in a divorce situation that they had no control over to begin with. So how does this all work, and what does this mean for us, and how do we navigate this verse? So, Pastor Nick?
Yeah, I had someone come up to me after service who said, told me a story. He said at one point he was dating a woman who had been divorced, and he was concerned that if they were to get married, he was concerned that he was actually forbidden by the Bible from marrying her because of this verse, that to do so would be to commit adultery, and therefore because he didn't want to sin against God, his only option was to not marry her. It's a really interesting question because think about all these scenarios. And I know that these scenarios, they aren't just hypotheticals, right? These do exist, and they're not even that uncommon, right? Like, let's say that a man abandons his wife, right? Runs off with someone else or just leaves and divorces her. Maybe she didn't want the divorce. She wanted to be married. And he leaves her. And it was not, for any reason other than sexual immorality. He just wanted to go and do something else now. Or maybe it's some other worse reason. So he leaves her. Now she is at no fault of her own. It says that she's counted as an adulterer. or an adulteress, someone who's committed adultery. Now, how is that? Some people would look at that and they say, is that even fair, right? Like, is it good? Okay, let's go on to another scenario. There's a woman who's been abandoned by her husband, and then another guy comes along, and they're both single and want to get married. So would it be a sin for him to marry this woman because of that previous thing? There's been a lot of opinions on this over the years. They kind of fall into 2 or 3 categories, and I'm not really going to argue those categories. What I would say is this. Here's how I understand this passage, having wrestled through it. I'm open to discussion on it, but I'm pretty sure this is how it should be understood. And of course, I've read a lot of materials on this as well, right? Like, so it's not just like this is the Nick interpretation or this is interpretations. The one that I find to be the most biblical and theologically cohesive. It's the one that, again, I've researched and studied. So it'll go like this. I mentioned this in a sermon, but I'll say it again. Anything that deviates from God's design for marriage counts as adultery. And so therefore, let's say a woman who her husband divorced her at no fault of her own. And so essentially she's being dragged into a situation that is an adulterous situation. The word for adultery is different than the word for sexual immorality, right? That word is the word porneia, from which we get our word fornication. But when it comes to adultery, of course, I know that most of our listeners don't speak Hungarian, but it's a little bit helpful in Hungarian because the word for adultery literally means the breaking of a marriage, which is what adultery means, right? So it's a marital situation that's been broken. And so that woman is now in a marital situation that's been broken at no fault of her own. Can she be remarried? I personally think she can because that marriage has ceased to exist, even in the eyes of God. I think that she is free. And Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 7. If your husband abandons you or your spouse abandons you, then you are free, right? What that means, free from that marriage. You're no longer bound by it. Okay, so the point being this, she's brought into a situation which is a broken, sinful situation. Now, there's a difference, though, between somebody who is sinful in, let's say, a non-culpable way and someone who is sinful in a culpable way, right? So think about it like this. A child that's born into the world is born as a sinner. That is their identity. That is their condition that they're born into. And yet they haven't ever committed an act of rebellion, right? And yet they're counted as a sinner. Well, in this case, it's a very similar situation. Here is a person, in this case, a woman, who is counted as being involved in this adulterous situation, right? Counted with adultery, even though perhaps in some cases she has done no act of rebellion against God's command. And to put it in like super layman's terms, I believe that what Jesus is saying is this. Obviously, the guy who left his wife for a reason other than what was justified, obviously he's committing adultery. But Jesus is saying, listen, you're not just a jerk because you sinned by doing that. You're a double jerk because now you caused your wife to be counted as an adulteress, your ex-wife. And you know what? You're not just a double jerk. You're a triple jerk because now any other guy who comes and marries her, he's going to be dragged in to that broken situation that deviates from God's plan. He's going to be involved in it too. So you just brought in all these, you're the one who's culpable. And you now are not just culpable for your own sin. Now you're culpable for the sin that you brought these other people into. But to those who are concerned that, for example, they're saying, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, I would agree with that. I don't think that Jesus is saying that you did something wrong, especially if you, I mean, in some cases, it's very obvious. Like you're very passive in the whole thing. It was something that was done to you. He's not saying that you're wrong. He's saying that you're involved in a situation that deviates from God's design. So I think that that's the thing. But I would say this. If you're so concerned about being called a sinner, understand in this passage, Jesus also called you a murderer and he called you a liar and he called you all kinds of things because the purpose of it is to say you are far more sinful than you even realize or than any of us would prefer to recognize. But blessed are the poor in spirit. It's okay, right, to have your sinfulness pointed out, because Jesus isn't pointing it out in order to hurt you. He is pointing it out because he's come to bring the solution for that problem. But unless you recognize that, then you can never experience the blessing that comes from recognizing your spiritual bankruptcy.
Yeah. I mean, the whole section is, about being perfect, and whichever category you want to focus in on, there's the realization that, oh boy, I am not perfect there. I am not perfect there. I'm not perfect there. And then the whole context, always, especially this time studying through the Sermon on the Mount with you, has been a reminder of how poor in spirit we are. That it all just kind of circles right back to the beginning of the sermon. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And so we think, well, what does that mean exactly? And, you did a good job explaining it. But as we continue going through, all of a sudden you go, oh, that's what that means. Oh boy, I am not perfect, and I'm more bankrupt than I realized. I thought maybe I was, just low on funds, but no. I'm bankrupt. So one more question, maybe.
Sure.
So it talks about enemies. Love your enemies, and so the question is, as Christians, as followers of Christ, are we allowed to have enemies? Can we have an enemy? Could we even use that term? So what's that about?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say this, like, clearly then we're told to love our enemies. So there's a difference between hating somebody and having an enemy. And I told you this story before, but I'll tell everybody now. I saw a bumper sticker on the back of a Subaru, which is, of course, where all good bumper stickers live. And the sticker said, "Enemies are just friends who you choose not to understand." And I thought, what a gaslighting statement, man. That's the definition of gaslighting. That it's not that person who's the problem. It's you who's the problem because you choose not to understand them. Now, okay, in some cases, maybe that's true. But to say that as a blanket statement, I mean, that's so wrong. It's so not true, right? Okay, let me give you some examples. Okay, let's talk about ISIS. Let's say I'm a Christian in the Middle East and ISIS wants to cut my head off. Well, I would consider that person an enemy because Jesus defines an enemy in this verse as those who persecute you and harmfully mistreat you. So that's what ISIS wants to do. They want to kill you and cut your head off. So are they actually just a friend? If you could just understand their perspective, maybe their perspective is actually evil, right? Like, I think that's the point. If their perspective is evil and you understand it, you haven't become friends. You've just understood that they actually really are your enemy. And yet you're called to do this radical thing, which is, in spite of that, to love them, bless them, and pray for them. And I mean, we could go on. You could say, okay, like Nazis and Jews during the Holocaust. I mean, what a terrible thing it would be to say to those Jewish people, these people are actually your friends. You just choose not to understand them. Maybe actually you do understand. Maybe you understand their ideology. But their ideology is evil, right? And so if someone has an ideology that's evil and they are acting upon that, understanding them better isn't going to fix the situation, right? So there are some people that you're not going to be able to fix that, right? Like, they are aligned against you, and it's not a matter of just understanding where they're coming from. It's a matter of that what they're doing is evil. They're persecuting you and harmfully mistreating you. And still, Jesus says, and yet there are ways for you to love them, for you to pray for them, and for you to bless them. Now, here's what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't advocate for somebody to, like we talked about, Jesus is not saying that you should tolerate abuse, mistreatment, these sorts of things. Not that you should enable someone to abuse you and mistreat you under the heading of any of these. But listen, no matter what that person is, for example, let's say there's somebody who's been in an abusive relationship or situation where somebody has done something to them that was very wrong. Are we saying in this verse, you need to go and bless that person, bake them cookies, take them to their house and do that? Well, in some cases that would not be the right thing to do. You would be sending someone into a situation where they might be putting themselves in harm's way again. And that certainly wouldn't be according to the heart of God. And I'll tell you why, because God's word has a lot to say about protecting those who are vulnerable. And so we want to protect those those who are vulnerable, not put them back into harm's way. And yet there are ways that hurt person can pray for that person, bless that person, without entering into a relationship where they're making themselves vulnerable to being abused again. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, is there anything you want to add that we left out from questions or from the sermon that you're like, oh, I wish I would have, had more time to share that?
Yeah, there's always more. I one thing that I wasn't planning on spending as much time on, but I did, and I felt that it was good, was the turning the other cheek part, because I think that people, I actually know historically there have been a lot of misunderstandings about this. In fact, there was a famous thing between like Tolstoy and Gandhi, where Gandhi got his thinking from Tolstoy, and Tolstoy was a major literalist when it came to the Sermon on the Mount. And so when he read these things like, don't resist an evil one, Tolstoy's conclusion is, therefore, we should not have government or police, because the role of government and police is to resist evil. And he said, well, this is saying that essentially we should have like a type of anarchy, if you will, where there are no police. And if someone wants to harm you, you just let them. That was his conclusion. And Gandhi took a lot of his ideas from Tolstoy. And, there's this kind of historical debate, if you will, between the nature of man, which is, but it was played out in the writings of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, the great Russian writers. Dostoevsky, if you read his writings, he clearly believes in the depravity of man. As crime and punishment, that's what it's about. And I mean, actually, to a degree, the Brothers Karamazov is about that. But then, if you get into Tolstoy, a lot of his stuff is actually arguing for the opposite, that people are basically good. And it's this reading of the Sermon on the Mount, and these passages in particular, that led him off into this weird direction where he was saying, well, he says that you should do these things and turn the other cheek. And therefore, he actually went to that extreme of saying, just like let people abuse you and these sorts of things. So that's why I spent more on that. And the difference between like society and personal relationships is important, because if you don't understand that dichotomy, the problem is that then you will think that Jesus might be contradicting the law of Moses, where the law of Moses said an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Jesus says, no. Well, he's not saying no in civil practice. He's pointing out that this is something that applies to society, law and order, and justice systems, judges. But when it comes to personal offenses, there's a different tact that God's word tells us to take, which is love your neighbor as yourself. And your neighbor actually includes your enemies. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was good. It's all been good. So we are glad that you joined us today for the Sermon Extra. And again, whatever platform you're on, click the like button, leave a comment, tell us how blessed you were by it. If you have questions, leave a question in the comment section. We'd be happy to respond to you there too. So otherwise, we will see you next time on the next Sermon Extra.